what does this Christian political vision look like? What does it look like to be a Ellul's book, The Presence of the Kingdom? What does the presence of the kingdom look like?
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings, this is Burn Power, the Anadromist, coming to you from a hot day here in Tbilisi, Georgia. And today what we're doing is starting a new kind of, what should we call it? Let's call it inaugurating a new occasional segment to the channel. No, it's not the banging music instruction. Yeah, that's what it's going to be. No. It's going to be dialogues, Anadromous Dialogues. And these will just be held from time to time. As you can tell, my camera equipment isn't top-notch, so I don't have the wherewithal to do this all the time. But I can do it now and then, and I've been in conversation every now and then with a man out in Manitoba in Canada, and his name is Julian Waldner, and he is a Hutterite. Lives on a Hutterite community. Hutterites are a kind of Anabaptist in the Mennonite line who broke away and formed communities not quite as strict as the old Amish, but nevertheless they will use modern technological devices like the internet, but everything is held in common. They don't believe in private property. And over the last year or two, I have occasionally passed a bit of correspondence with Julian, and I've found it interesting. And he came to me with a question not long ago, so I thought, hey, let's experiment with recording a conversation, see how it goes. So, without any further ado, let's talk to Julian and find out, well, we cover a variety of subjects. Many of them Christian, not all of them, but we discuss the difference in different kinds of churches and what Christianity means in this age we're living in today.
Yeah, where do we kind of jump in with the big topic we were going to discuss?
Well, I'll let you.
Hard to pin it down.
Yeah. Well, you got in touch with me, and we've mentioned a few things. But what have you been focused on in this? What do you remember?
Okay, the 1960s might even be a good jumping off point because. Mm-hmm. So I was contacting you about, the Pageau or even Peterson's project.
Sure.
And I was saying there's something about that project that is sort of a kind of very, very conservative, something very conservative about it, something very, Kierkegaard's language of Christendom. It's a sort of return to a sort of Christendom project. Mm-hmm. It sees religion as kind of unifying society. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then there's this other strain, and then you come into how Pageau especially interprets the figure of Christ, mm-hmm. and Christ becomes the kind of how do you describe it? Maybe the logos which sort of reveals the cosmic order of things, and this is how things lay themselves out. Mm-hmm. And from that kind of microcosm, you have a pattern of how reality works, how society works, and a sort of very coherent hierarchical order. And I think I was contrasting that with my own tradition, the Anabaptists,
Sure.
and then other sort of line of thinkers, I pointed to Ellul, to Kierkegaard, to some others who sort of see the exact opposite. Religion is not a unifying force in society. It's always a kind of disruptive presence that is always kind of undermining the status quo. And the figure of Christ is not sort of for the establishment of this cosmic hierarchy, but he's precisely in his lowliness and in his humility and in his vulnerability and his poorness.
Right.
He is kind of always coming underneath our sort of ordinary human way of doing things and pointing to a much more radical way.
Right.
And so I suppose I'm wondering, I think to connect this now to the 1960s, I think someone like Ellul or Kierkegaard would be much more comfortable living in a post-1960s world than someone like Pageau or Peterson is. So
I tend to look at, in different ways, Pageau and Peterson are looking at the deconstruction project of modernity, postmodernity, and they're seeing that, we've pulled quite a few bricks off of the house, and we're getting down to the foundations. And I think what they're doing is saying, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to blow up the foundations. We want to keep building. So they're finding bricks that are laying aside, and they're putting them back in. And because I think, frankly, we need some sort of, protection over our heads. We need something. We need to feel like we actually inhabit the world. And what's happened is I think people now feel more adrift. They feel like they don't have a house. I mean, just to use the analogy a little more, it's like there's no roof that's solid over their head. There may be a few beams left, and I think Pageau is looking at the Orthodox tradition and saying, well, they've remained the same for all these years. That's a solid building. Peterson is looking at, I think, he's looking at just the fact that people need the transcendent. They need something much more than just the kind of thin gruel of materialism. So in different ways, I think they're looking at all the bricks and stuff and trying to put them back in different ways, and I think they're not the only ones. In a way, I'm trying to do something similar. I also recognize, we're not going backwards. The world is not going back to 2019. We're in a different world now. And as a result, we have to come to some sort of terms with the nature of this world. But it is an extremely, what's the best way to put it? This world is very unpredictable. People born after a certain age seem to have almost no certainties. Someone was actually, I made a comment on, I think the video I just did on propaganda, where I mentioned that I used to, I would study horror films. I still do. And there would be, good Christian people would say, brother, are you sure that you're not opening yourself up to demonic presences or something? To which I would, without going into my real explanation, I would give them the shorthand, which was, and this would be usually enough to calm them. I would just say, I really feel God has called me to do this. It's a bit like, a policeman has to deal with certain kind of things, or a doctor has to deal with certain kind of things. This is what I do. Now, I don't think that that's an excuse for not understanding what those things are, since so many people watch them. But nevertheless, at that point, which we're talking about the 80s, it was a way of kind of calming the nervousness of Christians at that point, who had already separated themselves enough from the world that they didn't understand what was going on. And I found, as I still do, horror films to be a very good way of getting myself into the fears of the times and to understand them. And I am not particularly, I can watch whatever horror film. There are a few that I wouldn't watch for various reasons because they participate in the reality of their subject too much. But most of them, I can watch no matter whatever is going on and go home and go to sleep, and it's not a problem for me. I don't have nightmares about these things. But the point is that, so I said this, and some guy commented, he said, like, how can you just say that God called you to do this? Are you saying it's like Moses, that you tried to escape and God, just backed you into a corner and there's nothing else you could do? And I wrote back saying, no, it's not like that at all. It's just simply, it's a gift. I'm able to hold this material, deal with it, make some sort of sense out of it, and then pass it back to other people and say, what do you think of that? What do you think we're saying to ourselves here? And then he wrote back that, he still had questions. And finally I said, the thing is, it's obvious that given the year I was born in, I have a lot more certainty than you do. Being someone probably, he sounded like he was under 30 somewhere, And he wrote back and saying, yeah, that is a problem. Because we live in a time where certainty is really hard to grab a hold of, which is why I think Peterson took off, because he was talking, so there's got to be more than just the stuff. There's got to be more to it than that. And Pageau is saying there are patterns that we can see in everything, and he's somewhat using the Orthodox tradition to understand that, but it's more, he's doing something. I was talking with a friend here in Georgia. It's like more than just plain Orthodoxy going on there. There's other traditions going into the mix. And he doesn't really talk about what those traditions might be, but it's clear it's more than simply the Orthodox tradition, although it certainly is a lot of that as well. It's basically him building on top of that.
He often has this kind of... He sometimes will have the rhetoric in his videos of, the pre-moderns did this, and modernity has done away with this, and I'm just returning to that. And I think you're right that there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I mean, he does kind of own up to that a bit when he talks about reading Heidegger and some of the deconstructionists and the kind of phenomenological shift.
But here's what I don't know. I don't know what he was reading when he and his brother first came up with these ideas. I have his brother's book, and it's clear to me he's making very specific statements, but I'm wanting to know, well, what are these built upon? That is to say, where is the, these aren't all simply orthodoxy. There's something else going on here as well. He's read something else, and I'm not sure what that is. Because, it hasn't been my life's goal to seek that down. I know that when he talks about symbolism and I talk about symbolism, we're in two different worlds. There is some overlap. But for him, the symbol is almost always allegorical. That is to say, it's a this is that. So that the Garden of Eden was on a hill, he says in one tradition, and that the fall was literally a fall down the hill. And I'm sitting there going like, okay, where did you get that? I'm the kind of person who wants to know sources, always. It's like, and someone who doesn't reveal their sources to me, I'm always I want more answers. So, but that's also, to get back to, for instance, the difference between Orthodoxy and Protestantism, one of the things that it's interesting to me, the move towards Orthodoxy has raised certain questions about my own Protestantism. But I think good questions, because I've come to see, okay, here's the difference between the Orthodox and the Protestants, is that the Orthodox tradition is based upon we'll say a journey that the first century church took along the way, various things were added. So, for instance, one would not find icons in the first century.
Yeah.
However, one can see, for instance, in the construction of the temple, the use of cherubim as part of the Ark of the Covenant and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's anti-Christian, but it was certainly, this grew up in a milieu where I would say people needed visual representation. Now, I look at myself and I see, for instance, what Martin Luther was reacting to, what the Anabaptists were reacting to, what John Calvin was reacting to, and others. And I see these things and I say to myself, we're coming out of the prophetic tradition. And that tradition is more related to the prophets in the Old Testament. It's not that it's not Christian, but rather it's the kind of thing that has to come along every now and then and say, make straight the way of the Lord. In other words, there's a lot of junk in the way, and we need to clarify things. And that's
so you kind of think, in the present moment, it's time for Protestants to shut up a bit and let the Orthodox talk?
Well, one of the things that's happened is that when you have a mega church, and you have 5,000 people in a building also kind of singing and swaying, and there is some repetitious song over and over, and a band up front playing, and it's basically a theatrical service, no one's protesting anything. It's not about protest anymore. It's not about that kind of prophetic clarification. It becomes instead, I often think that many aspects of the Protestant churches today are just as corrupt in their way as the Catholic Church had become by the 14th century.
Oh, yeah.
So the question then is, I've come to value my tradition, and I think one of the things that prevents me from going completely Orthodox, even though I'm in an Orthodox country now, is that I am... it's just like it's born and bred in me to say, well, in a sense, I'm asking for proofs. I'm asking, where did this come from? I'm asking for origins of statements. I'm asking, where did we get that notion from? I'm wanting to know more about why we're doing this. Where does this come from in history? Don't tell me it always was, because nothing just always was. Everything comes from somewhere, Mm-hmm. So I want to know where various practices come from. And one of the things, you see, in the Orthodox tradition, one of the first things that new...
catechumen converts.
Thank you. Are asked to do is to accept the authority of the church.
Yeah.
And that this will be the way you interpret the scriptures. And I understand that because I've met a lot of Protestants who were, quite far off from any standard biblical interpretation that I had ever heard of, just because they were doing it out of their, rather uneducated brains. That is to say that you've got someone who doesn't have much of an education, who reads the Bible, and the classic joke was people who played what we call biblical I Ching, where you take the Bible, open it randomly, and point to a passage, and then do what God tells you to do. So the joke is, you open your hands, and the first passage you hit is, and Judas went and hung himself. And then the guy goes, that can't be right. Oh, God, please. And it's like shaking the box. It's like, God, please, please, please. Opens it again, puts his finger down and goes, go thou and do likewise. And he goes, okay, where's the rope? But in a sense, you get that sort of uneducated approach to the Bible. I mean, I've run into quite a few Christians in my time, all Protestants, although there have been a few Catholics as well. And I'm sure if I sniffed around the Orthodox tradition, I'd find a few Orthodox as well, who have essentially fabricated something out of, not having any church authority behind them. That is to say, of just simply conjuring this stuff up out of their own interpretation, which is why I think the Bible says there is no private interpretation of the Scripture. That is to say, you can't just suddenly see human sacrifice in there. It's like, no, sorry. No matter how much you'd want to, some sort of psycho would want to, you're not going to find that in there. And the rest of us are going to go like, no, don't do it. It's not right. You're off. Sorry. And I think that, but then the emphasis then can lead to problems with, well, what if the authorities are wrong?
Yeah.
You see, and that was the issue that led Martin Luther to his rebellion. He never actually wanted to stop being a Catholic. He just simply wanted the church to kind of own up to some of the problems they were having. And in fact, since that time, they've owned up to quite a few of those 95 theses. So, but there is something in me that will always kind of like, if I will sit there and go like, why are we doing that? And I can only take it back to the prophetic tradition. Interestingly enough, when Jesus was approached and asked, well, what about John the Baptist? And Jesus said many things, but one of the things he said is, what's interesting about John the Baptist is he comes eating nothing, just being an ascetic, living in the desert, and you accuse him of having a demon. And I come eating and drinking with the sinners, and you accuse me of being a drunkard. But there's a lot to be said there. But one of the things that occurs to me is Jesus in no way says which way is better. He doesn't say that the prophetic tradition of John the Baptist is superior to his own tradition. Nor does he say what I'm doing is superior to John the Baptist. He simply says here are two different approaches that God is using. See, one of the things is we have to let God choose to use different things, which is how I tend to look at what's going on. So that God can use the Anabaptists, he can use the Anglicans even. He can, I say even, because, there are some Anglicans way out on a ledge, especially Episcopalians in America, certain wings of them. But, it's not for me to judge. It's not my thing. And the Orthodox will often say, well, there is only one church. Hidden behind that is, and we're in, the Orthodox Church is that church. To which I'm saying, like, yeah, you're right, there is only one church, but it is splintered, and all of those splintered pieces are part of the same history. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's kind of like, there we are. It would be nice if one could reunite the whole thing, but that would take an awful lot, and who knows, maybe certain aspects of that will come true someday. But meanwhile, I think people are called to be faithful in whatever tradition they are. So, Okay, I've gotten away from the 60s here, so hunt me down and...
Okay, I mean, so I was talking about, this tradition that I'm saying Ellul maybe is the representative of who you've read way more of him. I've just started reading his little book, The Presence of the Kingdom.
Okay, what have you read by him?
Only this. And
okay, what are you trying to start at the beginning?
Is that the beginning?
Basically, it's like I would recommend. I think. Well, of course,
I read his Anarchy and Christianity one.
Okay. That's a good one. I would recommend highly the Subversion of Christianity and the Humiliation of the Word as the two which are linchpins of so many of the others. And the Humiliation of the Word in particular, what it does is it anchors both his sociological work and his theological work in one place. Okay. And I look at that as the culmination of his two streams of writing. And so, of course, all of his books on technology are great. Propaganda is one of the ones that I've gotten the most out of. But then his books, like his book, Hope in Time of Abandonment, is just, I think, a spiritual masterpiece. And one of the best books to read. I'm about to recommend that to a friend who's been going through a lot of problems since the death of his son. Because I think Ellul really hits a nerve there. But Ellul is also he would be the first to admit that each era the church is tempted by different things, and then what happens is that these things become accumulative, so that after a while, one temptation leads to another. So Ellul has no particular love for the Constantine moment, because he says that's when the Christians, it's almost like the devil said, well, I can't get them through persecution. Why don't we just give them the keys to the kingdom? See how they deal with power.
That is just, that's kind of the heart of my disagreement with Pageau. I think that's where it all comes from, is that split which happens there, where you have the kind of Christianity which becomes basically the Roman form of religion, which is to unite a society. That's what it becomes. It becomes this glue, and I just can't help but read his symbolic interpretation as sort of the kind of theology you would start to do once you become in charge of the empire and in charge of unifying the empire.
No, well, this is one thing about the Orthodox Church. They have always been connected with the governments and the kingdoms that they have been founded, and this has led to some big problems, and you can see this really in the history of the Russian Church. And one of the big problems is, okay, so are you here to do the bidding of the Tsar?
Yep.
And if the Tsar pays lip service to you, what is your relationship to power? And this became a real problem during the Soviet era, which the Soviets finally just said, we don't really need you. You're a church. We don't really care about this. And so they started shutting down churches and all of this stuff. And even still, Solzhenitsyn has, I think it's a letter to the Patriarch Pimen, I could be getting this wrong, but in which he criticizes the Russian church for essentially, this was in the 1970s, being kind of servile to the Soviet Union and just afraid. And part of it is that emphasis upon authority, which is not just the authority of the church, but also the authority of the state, leads to a real problem when you get serious tyrannies. And the Soviets could play with that because, and they knew, for instance, Stalin was just smart enough to know that, he's slaughtered off millions of people. And then came World War II, and Hitler attacks, and then he realizes, I need this church back to rally people. So he opens up the churches again, gives them more faith, has the filmmakers make movies of a spiritual sort of content, like Alexander Nevsky, and basically says, we need this to rally the people to fight. And then afterwards, he shuts it all down again. So it's one of the perennial problems I see with big O orthodoxy. The Catholics had the same problem. It was formulated slightly differently, and it tended to be the Pope versus the kings in the Catholic world. Whereas here it's each country has a separate patriarchy, and they, in fact, sometimes the Orthodox aren't even sure the other Orthodox in the other countries are fully Orthodox enough, and it gets into this sort of thing. I think every branch of Christianity has its weaknesses, and in Protestantism, the weakness is to go towards this almost antinomian individualism. Where each person is now just interpreting the Bible for themselves, which is precisely how the Catholics attacked Luther when they were saying, are you just going to say that every swineherd can read the Bible in his own, in German? And he would say, well, yeah, but
there's no real way out of that, because just being, like you said earlier, just joining the tradition isn't going to solve your problems either. Look at the Catholic Church, for example. Yeah. That is the most divided church out there. They have factions. The spectrum of factions within the church is completely equivalent to what you see within Protestantism, except they're still under this broad umbrella of Catholicism.
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of a perennial problem, I think.
Yeah. Well, the point is, and this is why Ellul's subversion of Christianity is so important. For instance, he traces back the Crusades and the Christians' use of violence to, well, of course, there's the Roman moment, but later there's the Islamic moment. And in order to fight Islam, the church started to become like Islam. You see, they started taking on this new relationship to the state. Also, but it's a fascinating book because there's so many, and we are now in another zone where people are trying to figure out, like all these new things are happening in terms of sex, gender, race, and there are some people who are just simply going to, it's just like, well, yes, how else could we live but by these new ideas? And other people are going to be stick in the muds and go like, no, we're not doing that. And some people to different degrees. And I think the best way is to have some understanding of what's actually going on. I have a friend of mine staying here who's a Christian, and he was a teacher at a Christian college. So we have some pretty interesting discussions. And one of the things I've been talking with him about recently is one of the reasons why the people who hold, will say, any residue, not just traditional-minded, but because there are very few really, truly traditional-minded people left, but any residue of tradition from the older Western society, why these people from center to right, even sometimes center left to right, are having such trouble with what in shorthand is being called the woke, or the woke religion, or whatever, is it is because they can't define it. They have no word. Every time you use like even woke, just basically describes the racial stuff. So what do you call the trans stuff? What do you call the fourth wave feminist stuff? What do you how do these all relate? And I've seen it more like being the Hydra of mythology. And so in the Hydra of mythology, the beast had 7 heads. And each of the heads, I'm actually going to do a video on this pretty soon. Each of the heads, if you cut it off, 2 more would spring forth. And that's kind of hard. That's kind of hard to show in a movie, but it's been done a couple of times, but to limited success. But I think the problem is that in a sense, these new ideas are kind of like a demon. They've taken a lot of Christian ideas and old Western culture ideas and changed the meaning of the language so that, it's like they can use words like love. Love is love, which means precisely what? Because the one word you haven't defined in that sentence is the word love. So does it mean feelings are feelings? Does it mean the choice of the will is the choice of the will? Does it mean I will sacrifice myself as you sacrifice yourself? You see, what definition of love are we going? Or is it just, we'll all just get along and whatever you feel for someone, just act upon it? So, go.
This is where I'd like to dig in a bit. I mean, you were mentioning Ellul's the subversion of Christianity, where he has kind of this narrative of how things got how Christianity sort of took this wrong course, there's a similar kind of move that's being made with regards to Christianity, where you're kind of deconstructing the whole Western tradition and saying you sort of need to get back to this radical revolutionary core, and this kind of postmodern deconstruction move, which says, well, we need to deconstruct all of gender and race and all of these different. I mean, it's a similar. I think someone like Pageau would probably say someone like Ellul is kind of directly in the lineage of this deconstructionist type of movement. I mean, how do you
for being too
those
by relying on the prophetic tradition too much and being individualist?
I mean, the postmodern thing is in a sense a secular prophetic element. Or
well, what it is though is it has adopted the language that it's borrowed primarily from Christianity, not entirely, but primarily, and it's for instance, it's adopted the language of social justice. But it's not actually performing social justice. It is instead performing virtue signaling and performing, the cancel culture isn't social justice. That is something else. What's been lost in this, in the real left, that you have a real care for the working class people. But this new group has so they borrowed from the left, but the left itself borrowed from Christianity to talk about the value of the oppressed. All the language about the value of the oppressed comes straight from Christianity and nowhere else. And there's a prehistory in Judaism. It doesn't. This is the point of Tom Holland's book, Dominion. Where we are is that there are these words. In fact, Francis Schaeffer, I used this quote once in one of my videos where Francis Schaeffer is saying, once the Christian consensus is gone, which I think we can pretty much say it is, the very words which used to provide life, words about freedom, words about truth and love and all these things, will be the same words used to destroy the society. Because they've stripped the meaning of the words and put something else into them. So the word love is love. That word love does not mean charity, does not mean agape. It does not mean the love in a marriage, you see. It means something else. It seems, to my knowledge, to go back to people like Jack Kerouac, which was one of the points I made earlier in my How We Got Here series. And he's basically just saying, we just kind of love everybody, which means nothing because it's too waffly a definition. So that after a while in the 60s, what happens is love starts off in the 60s being more of we've got to care for humanity, and ends up by the end of it being like Stephen Still's saying you got to love the one you're with, which doesn't mean care for humanity. That means have sex with. So somehow the word love shifted in the 1960s in particular. But we've seen other words shifting as well. So the words like community. Well, community, you're in the Anabaptist tradition, so you understand what community is very well. It has to do with physical presence with a group of people, and everyone has their own jobs. But now we talk about the black community. What is that? That's huge. That's
the Discord community.
Yeah, or virtual communities, or people will say there's a horror community because I stay in touch with what's happening in horror, and I'm going like, yeah, right. Let's face it. There's a lot of alienation going on here and abstraction. And the truth is that I am, through digital means, through technological means, able to keep in touch with people like yourself who are out there. I have no doubt that if I went to visit you, you would treat me very well. But, however, in this state, we are in a highly mediated state of abstraction. So that this is good, but this is not a substitute for real world presence. And in fact, one of the reasons why, like I was saying before about the Hydra, the thing we're doing is, what will happen is the trans head will be moving. The woke anti-racist head will be moving. The feminist head will be moving. And then maybe we'll hear from PETA or some other head. I do think there's another head that's slowly raising its head, and it'll be something of an eco-fascist head. But what it is we're not describing the body of this one beast. So people use all sorts of words to describe it. So it's Marxist or cultural Marxism or postmodernism or wokeism, or, they'll say it comes from the Frankfurt School. It comes from this person or that person's ideas. And you'll see this when Jordan Peterson went to try to talk with Slavoj Žižek about his ideas. He came prepared to talk about old school Marxism, but Slavoj Žižek was talking about a newer strain of Marxism, and neither of them, however, were talking about the influence. What is the body? You see, and in a way, it's like a demon. Like I was saying, that you can't make it leave till you know its name, because right now there's nothing. You can't. Every time you say, "Oh, you shouldn't use critical race theory," someone will say, I'm not using critical race theory. I'm just an anti-racist. They'll sidestep with these words. You'll say, that's too postmodern. And then someone will say, like, well, you don't really understand postmodernism. And there are many ways in which this thing is not postmodern. You see, it both is and isn't. It both is Marxist and isn't. What is the beast? Having no definition of it, having no word that encompasses what it is, it's very hard to fight. Because it is... It always has, like I say, there are heads we haven't seen yet. So even, like, I know one person said, well, they're identitarians, so that's like, which would be in the same category as the KKK or the, other people who want their own group to be well. Well, there is an identitarian aspect to it. But like I said, when the eco-fascist one raises its head, that's not identitarian. That's going to be something very different. And yet I would say they're obviously all connected. I look at veganism. Now, some veganism is just people who are tired of the mechanical production of meat. I understand that. But other people, it's like a religion. And they just can't stand the idea that anybody eats meat. And this, too, is part of this beast. As PETA, this anti-vegetarian. But it's this weird classification of animals. But, you could look at disabilities. You could look at, for instance, what's the relationship of this stuff to all the immigration policies? And if you really want to get into it, then you can start saying, well, what's the relationship of this stuff going to be when we can choose the DNA components of our children? Or when we can choose the cybernetic components of our bodies?
Yeah.
What about people who are already calling themselves robosexual? They're all connected. The transhumanist, it's part of all of this is in this thing. But we don't understand it yet. So one of the problems is like, what was it? This guy, Michael Knowles, was saying, I know what it is. In critical race theory, everyone's just critique. And that's all they're doing is they're tearing things down. I'm going like, that's how they're fighting. That's not what they are. So you can't win. You can't make headway against them because they're too amorphous still. And yet at the same time, they've managed to secure a certain amount of the power bases within society. So, they have a great deal of power related to the, tech. So Facebook, Twitter, Google, that kind of stuff. They're also in the governmental institutions. So we're seeing them in the military. We're seeing them in so many of the legislative bodies. They also are in control of so much of education. So that when they're saying, let's have drag queen story hour, or, there are new children's books, which basically, I've just ordered one so I could look at it myself, which basically tell very young kids how to snitch on their parents, or how to tell them, how to scream at their parents, essentially, for being evil, or, you have... these different, and by the way, and they also control the media and the entertainment industry. Oh, by the way. So they've managed to circle the bases. I mean, there's a lot more than 4 bases there if we're sticking with a baseball analogy. But, they've got a whole team, we could say. They're playing very strong. The other side is basically still every man for themselves. Still each person is an individual who can choose and should be free, which is a nice dream. But unfortunately, this larger thing, the only thing that seems to be working really against this hydra of wokeism is the fact that they're pushing to crazy extremes now. And that eventually the people in the middle are going to say, hey, we really don't want that. And that would be the hope. But like I say, we've deconstructed enough, but what's being built on top of it is something like a techno-paganism. And
I don't see quite the techno element there, but...
Well, because all of this stuff revolves completely around technology. That is to say, none of the stuff in the gender and feminism stuff would be there without technology.
An interesting.
You know,
the transgender stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That's all technology. You know, but likewise, even the racial stuff, you know, it's being spread through technology. It's being we're being told your technology must be. I mean, there are new rules coming down every day. It seems about what has to happen with your technology in relationship to this stuff. We want everyone to be equal. But like I say, if you go back and say, so that's what it is. It's extreme egalitarianism. You're missing something. There's a big component missing from this. Like I said, there's so many components to it. It's something that's been slowly growing in a serious way. It started after World War II, based upon philosophical and technological components before that. And this has been essentially the point of my How We Got Here, is that this thing has slowly been assembling itself. And now we're at a point where and propaganda is a central element, because propaganda affects you like by osmosis, like getting the measles. You're just infected by propaganda, which is the whole point of Ellul's thought on the subject, is that people often think propaganda is those lies they tell. But Ellul's point is that no, any society of a certain size is going to have to use propaganda. And once you do, everything boils down to essentially, for instance, he says Christianity is watered down to something that's essentially the equivalent of an ideology on the level of selling soap. And that is what we've sing. Christianity has become...
Got that from Kierkegaard.
Yeah, very possible.
That sounds... I think there's the famous Kierkegaard thing about a guy selling soap. Mm-hmm. And he says... he buys the soap. I think he buys the soap for like 10 cents, and then he sells it for 8 cents, and he says, "Look at all the soap I've sold."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, that's a lot there. I mean, for me personally, and I know this is true for other people I know, aside from the kind of extremes, like when you get into the kind of gender stuff, especially. It's really hard to kind of raise the will to resist this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah,
and part of it probably has to do with propaganda. Part of it has to do, like you said, the Christian language and the Christian element of this, and you just don't want to be the guy who's standing against racism and so on.
Right.
But the other element for me is. So we were contrasting this prophetic and this what was the other language he used? Maybe the traditional element in Christianity. And as someone who stands within a tradition that is sort of quintessentially prophetic in a sense, where you're kind of sort of always saying, get back to the basics, and Christianity is I could just point out some of the radical elements of the tradition, community of goods, like private possessions are actually not a thing. Non-violence, even stand against infant baptism is kind of a resistance to any kind of a large state church. Mm-hmm. And so if you're part of that tradition, you kind of have a problem with Christendom. You have a problem with the status quo, just like these this amorphous blob that we've been trying to identify. And so there's a connection there where you're not comfortable saying, well, we need to go back to the 1950s because everything was perfect then. And you're not comfortable saying, well, you're not comfortable with this woke stuff either because this doesn't represent the Christian revolutionary vision either. This isn't the
no. It's actually it's very anti-Christian.
And so I think maybe my overt way of resisting this has been to kind of try to articulate what does this Christian political vision look like? What does it look like to be a Ellul's book, The Presence of the Kingdom? What does the presence of the kingdom look like? Mm-hmm. And kind of to sort of, I mean, even this ecological stuff. I have my own vision about ecological, our relationship to the natural world that doesn't quite align with that, but there's some overlap, and so it's
of course
it's hard to sort of push back in a direct way, but I'm sort of pushing back in an indirect way where I'm kind of laying out an alternative vision and saying this is the way Christians should go. And on the other hand, I'm not comfortable with a kind of status quo. Well, we need to keep burning all the coal we can. So that's a kind of tension, is that you just don't feel there's just no place, I guess. I don't know.
There is no easy resolution. There is no, obviously the ecological situation is a mess, which is exactly why the Greta Thunbergs in the world can make headway with this, because, her and AOC they have as a wedge. They say, we want to do the Green New Deal. Then you look at the provisions of the Green New Deal, and it's all the woke hydra. It's just coming right in like a wedge on the basis of the fact that we must do something about the earth, which is why I say right now it looks like, 1 minute it's BLM protesting, buildings burning down, this sort of thing. The next minute it's some sort of trans athletes in the Olympics, but believe me, this thing is going to get much bigger before the end of the summer. It'll be one thing after another, but we're always being tugged and pushed, not seeing that it's all one thing. Now, one of the interesting things about this Hydra is some of the heads actually don't agree with each other and like each other.
Yeah.
And so it is always possible they will start attacking themselves. And you see this with the trans versus the other LGBT people. It's like people are starting to lose any sense of, what's male and female? If it's not connected to biology, what is it connected to? And the answer is, it's connected to whatever you want to dream and be. Or to quote the Rocky Horror Picture Show, don't dream it, be it. Which to me is exactly the future we're moving into. The only problem with that whole statement is we're being sold what to be. It's not simply like you're going to come up with some beautiful vision of yourself. No, you're being sold by the larger corporations who have to sell you something. These new identities, because they see that this is the way to go forward. There will be new markets here for, we will sell you identity. I look around and I never, it's just like I see, there were, in Alaska, there was a young man who told his mother he was a she, and she was actually from Thailand. And my big question is, would he have said that if the television wasn't on? You see?
No.
It's like if he didn't get that idea from somewhere, would he have said that? Would he have just in the natural course of his life has said that? And I think what we don't realize is that this radical individualism is actually really easy to control, which is what we're seeing, because propaganda has to allow you, no matter what propaganda one follows, to feel that one still has agency.
I mean, it's connected to this idea that you should be expressing or following your desires. I mean, can you think of any more deranged idea than the idea that your desires are an infallible guide to what you should be doing with your life?
Oh yeah,
and just how susceptible that would be to social pressure and to propaganda and to
that is what we're seeing.
That is.
Yeah,
that is just,
that's why in my conceptual humanity video, it was a lecture I gave at L'Abri, I pointed out this whole movement called, it's now called BID, it was at that time called BIID, which was body integrity disorder. So there are these people who think they were born defective, following the logic of the trans movement, and what they have an extra limb that needs to be cut off. Well, they only have the proper number of limbs, so they think they should be amputees. because this is what they were really born to be, and they will use this language. And you just sit there and say, wait a second. But that is the logic of it. I mean, and it eventually goes to, there was, here's where it ends up. It ends up at this weird thing of we can no longer define humanity at all. So if people, for instance, right now were given a choice of what was the DNA component of your child, what would they choose? Well, a lot of people, just say, well, we would have such a better world because we could eliminate diseases, and we would choose, looks, fashion model, brains, Einstein. I often say, well, why not looks, Einstein, brains, fashion model? but instead, what we're really going to get is people who will, like there were these two lesbians who lived together who were parents who wanted to have a baby. So they kept trying over and over with in vitro processes until they got one that was also deaf. They wanted to have they were deaf, they wanted to have a deaf baby. That's what we'll get. We'll get people who choose for their children what they want them to be. And, for instance, if you realized your child could make more money being a certain way, how many people would choose to, just change the DNA like this? So these sort of things that present themselves at first as things that will fix us and heal us, in the end, as Ellul points out, every technological solution is a solution to another technology that has an imbalance, which then creates a new imbalance, which will require a new technology to fix the imbalance. Or another French thinker, Paul VanderKlay, says, the invention of the train was the invention of the train accident, the train crash. The invention of the automobile was the invention of the automobile accident. And when people tend to first invent things, and we saw this with the rise of things like the internet and then later the cell phone and social media. At the beginning, everyone's talking about the benefits and the wonderful things these will do. This is the propaganda working. What they don't talk about is the real, the train accidents that are coming. They don't talk about the fact that our world is now cursed with the plague of the automobile. That is to say that whole communities in Southern California live completely at the whim of the automobile. That is to say, they've devised streets that have no sharp corners on them in these suburbs, so that the car can just go around without hitting it. They designed so that you don't have to get out of your car. You have a little remote that'll lift the door to your garage and then close right behind you, which means you don't have to spend time with the people who have the big lawns across the street talking to them. Mm-hmm. In other words, the automobile takes precedence. So to get a loaf of bread, you have to get in your car and drive 5 miles. Because there's no stores in any of these suburbs. The stores are always over there somewhere. There's no...
But now, and now you can just get Amazon to directly deliver to your door.
Yes, exactly. And...
Ellul in this book talks about means and ends, and then he says, we've moved beyond the point where the ends justify the means, and you have kind of the guy sort of imposing his will on reality and sort of forging something.
Yeah.
He says we've reached a point where there are no longer any ends, there's simply the means. It's simply the sort of the technological processes just unfolding, or the scientific processes unfolding, or kind of these ideological movements just have their sort of internal logic, and it just unfolds, and there's no real end that you're pursuing except the sort of the deconstruction, or the gain more technology, get more advanced, have more progress, get more scientific knowledge, gain more medical technology. And then he says, what is the purpose of this life you're enhancing year after year? Like, what is it all for? And that's kind of the question that doesn't get asked.
No. And if you do ask any of these questions related to technology, you're just called a technophobe. You're just simply like someone you don't understand. Look at all the good things technology has done. And granted, technology has done a lot of good things. I'm enjoying this conversation. That's a good thing that technology has done. I'm able to talk to someone in an Anabaptist community here in Canada, right? So it's Manitoba. So that's an interesting thing. I'm glad of that. I'm glad that it helps me to travel. It also helps people to travel way too much and to turn the world into some sort of giant, like, waste can for travelers. I've actually got this series that I want to do on tourism and reality, and how tourism has gone from being a fringe thing that people almost never did. They used to travel a bit, but not that far, to being something that became something that people did a bit, but by the time you get to the post-World War II era and the jet airplane, and now with the internet, I can sit here and make plans to travel to Papua New Guinea and get there, which is fine, because I'm sure there's not going to be many tourists out.
What is your stance towards technology? I mean, you're not advocating for a kind of Ludditism, and you're obviously not a techno-utopian. So, what's the kind of position you try to stake out?
Well, to find the meaning within it, because it is something we have made. It is something that has legitimate uses. It is also a genie we can't stuff into the back into the bottle, And in the second book of technology that Ellul writes, it's the Technological Society, and then the Technological System. And the third one, which I think is actually the best, the Technological Bluff, which he wrote shortly before his passing in 1986. He wrote in the Technological System that there are three environments that humanity has lived in, and the first being the natural world. And in the natural world, well, of course, you have the sunshine, you have, the animals for food, you have berries, and all of this. But the problem with the natural world is there are also great dangers in it. So some of those animals will kill you. Sometimes there will be, the heat will cause droughts. You will have tornadoes and hurricanes and cold winters and all of these things. So nature isn't just a good, but nevertheless it is our environment. Then he says, in order to fight that environment, we created the social environment, which starts with the building of cities. And in the building of cities, what that does is it allows people, for instance, to pull their grain together so that they have enough grain to weather droughts and things like that. It allows them to come together to protect the natural world from getting in, so that there aren't, lions and Cape buffalo and things like this coming into your house. Unfortunately, there were some animals that figured out how to get around that, like the rat said, okay, we'll take the city. The cockroaches were all in favor of this city. And the mosquito said, yeah, we've got it no matter what. Don't worry about us. So, but one of the problems of the city is you don't start getting serious plagues until you get a city, because it requires a concentration of people to spread it. Little communities of villages or whatever way out in the country, they don't get these things. Very rarely. Who gets it? People in big concentrations. Also, war is a problem. It is the big problem of these concentrations of people. There was fighting prior to the cities, but it's only once you get these big concentrations in the cities that you now have these really horrifying wars. But also, one can think of all the disasters related to love. And that would go all the way from pornography on one end to jealousies, and you're seeing too many people. Like a child in a candy store with too many options. Oh, she would be much better for me than she is, who I'm married to. This kind of stuff. So we, over time, slowly started to create a third environment, and that is the technological environment. And in the technological environment, it is the answer to many of the problems of both nature and the social environment. So, one of the things the technological environment does is, oops, we create a bomb. Well, that's going to stop us. The big bomb is going to stop us from wiping each other out because it's so frightening that we can't use it. Not that it'll always remain that way. But even, like I was saying about the car, the automobile, we created this thing which was an improvement on the old horse and buggy in terms of speed. Was it an improvement in terms of reliability? No, because cars break down all the time. And then what did the car demand? The car demands the road, the highway. It demands the flattened surfaces. It demands a reorganization of all of human living.
Yep.
And that's the problem. So, and Ellul then says, and then politics goes with that, because politics can only communicate through propaganda. And so what you get is, for instance, imagine this. There's a lot of traffic that goes from New York City to Greenwich, Connecticut. And so the highway there is just full of cars. So what do they have to do? They have to widen the highway and add an extra lane. And then what happens is, for a while, the traffic goes smooth again. And then what happens is more people say we can travel, more people move into the area because now we can communicate, we can travel between Greenwich, Connecticut and New York real easily, and then it all gets clogged up again. And he says, here's the one thing you can't do. You can't tell people to not drive their cars, because that's political suicide. And that's technology. Technology doesn't like to ever go backwards. It doesn't ever, you can't tell people we made a mistake with this whole automobile thing. We're going back to horses. I mean, you can't even imagine that being said by anybody, because it just...
Those are possibilities, yeah.
Yeah. And so what the internet has done, now he didn't live to see this world. I mean, he has some writing about the computer, but I don't think he would at all be surprised by any of the issues related to this world. I'm pretty sure had he lived another 10, 20 years, he would have written a book about the online world and what that means. And it would have been a fourth technology book, because I think that this world is so we have new dangers that we never thought of. Someone in Florida can say to a bunch of people, I'm going to burn a bunch of Qurans, and someone in Palestine can shoot someone in protest over that. These kind of things never happened before. I mean, in my lifetime growing up, some crackpot who was going to burn a few Qurans in Florida would never have been news outside of Florida. Mm-hmm. And nobody would have noticed that. It would have just been like, this crazy preacher over here. It wouldn't have been national news. There wouldn't have been people saying, see, I told you all the Christians were stupid. And that's what the modern technology does, is it opens up the possibilities. But what we tend to overlook is the possibilities for bad are just as opened up. Marshall McLuhan says that what is the media? The media is an extension.
Yeah.
So the light bulb extends daylight. There's a little device that we don't think about at all. We just use. And yet there are so many issues that come from it. People, when do we go to sleep now? It's all the light bulb. It's all if you've got light, you stay up. You see? So we live in a world, well, by extension, what McLuhan meant is everything is a medium. So it's like listening to music is a medium, the television is a medium, the light bulb is a medium. It's all immediate. It mediates, it comes between us. For instance, we don't need the sun, I have a light bulb here. See? Yep. But it extends some of our abilities as well. So
you can see further. Yeah.
Yeah, but the internet extends our nervous system across the world. It extends our, what used to be small thoughts can now travel
your emotions, your deep thoughts.
So this happens all the time, where two people meet, they start to form an attachment. Man and woman, we'll say, start to form an attachment through this. But then what happens is it gets too hot too soon, as far as like they're sharing too personal stuff, and then it just flames out. Because in reality, you can read the body language of a person, at least a person who understands these things can, but because now we're losing those people as well, because we're living in a time where people are completely awkward about real world communication, because we're here. So to me, one of the reasons why people can't do much about what's going on in the world is because they seem to think that this is the end, whereas this is only a means. So the good thing about, for instance, I'm glad there's Jonathan Pageau doing what he's doing. I'm glad there's Jordan Peterson. I'm glad there's a Paul VanderKlay. I'm glad of a whole bunch of people that I've found through YouTube, through the internet. At the same time, they are all atomized players in the field. And what doesn't exist anymore, for instance, is just a handful of people who are willing in real life to commit themselves to doing something. And I don't mean like a radical political plan, but just simply to creating things, whether it's ideas, to working on projects, to whatever. The fact that people are so atomized by our technology that we become just like little, it's like, oh great, there's like 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people on Earth now, or whatever. So it's like we see ourselves as just these little molecules, little bits of information floating through the stream. And every now and then it's like, oh goody, I've gotten 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which means nothing to me because, hey, none of those people are here.
Yeah.
Physically.
Okay. Hey, I gotta run, Vern. This is a blast.
Well, we will try it again. Let's try it again soon. So there you have it. Our conversation with Julian from Manitoba, from his Hutterite community. He was called away at the last minute there to go work, I'm sure, because he gets like an hour and a half for lunch when he's working in the office, and he had a chance to talk. And I'm glad he did. It was a very interesting conversation. Don't you agree? Anyway, just a reminder, if you appreciate the content on this channel, do subscribe to it. And also give this a like. I guess that helps somebody in the algorithms to find us. I don't have the biggest following, but I've got over 1,000 followers. That's pretty darn interesting. And also share this video. Maybe someday I'll talk to somebody else. So you never know who it's going to be. I have some ideas, but this was just an experiment. Let me know how you liked it. Did you like the conversation? Do you like Bern doing conversations? That would be interesting. And if you feel like contributing at all to the channel, there is a PayPal link down below. Go ahead and do that. Meanwhile, enjoy Tbilisi in the sun.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.